Hello, my name is Hakon and welcome back to my channel where today I'm going to talk a little bit about setting up Midi. Midi, an absolutely amazing and quite easy to use protocol for music devices to communicate with each other and control each other. And very often when you use Midi, you have a single device, MIDI generating device, that is going to be the main controller for several others. That is quite a common use case scenario. Very often you use just one device with one other device and then you're good to go. But if you use one to control several things, then there are potential complications, which I will get to. So let's, for instance, say that I want to control two different synthesizers with a sequencer, or two different sequences, or to have received two different sequences from a single sequencer. Quite a common use case scenario. Now, many synthesizers, unlike these phenols, but I'll get back to that, allow you to set which MIDI channel they receive MIDI data on. So for instance, if this was a different synthesizer, I could set this one to receive channel 1, this one to receive channel 2. Nice and simple, isn't it? And then I would send out MIDI on channel 1 and 2 from my Zoya, and I would take the output from the MIDI output from the Zoya to the input of one phenol, and maybe it has an output or a through that I can use to pass through the MIDI to the next one as well. This is quite commonly possible on lots of synthesizers. In fact, important thing to note, while most synthesizers don't have MIDI through, very often a MIDI out on a synthesizer is also a MIDI through. So check the manual. It may be possible that it just sends through whatever comes from outside as well, in addition to sending out what is generated by the device. So very often you are able to daisy chain your devices, and as long as latency isn't an issue, that allows you to connect things together and you have multiple devices controlled by one. And then there is, of course, the case where you only have MIDI inputs. You cannot daisy chain. You have to send MIDI from one device with only one plug to two devices, like the phenols, which only have MIDI inputs. Then there are a few options again. Usually you could use a sort of a MIDI through box or a MIDI duplicator that takes one input and sends it out identical copies of it to 2 or 3 or 4 outputs. Okay? And still they receive channel 1 and channel 2. And that would be fine as well. Quite simple to set up. But what if your MIDI enabled synths only receive on the same channel? So this is actually the case with my setup, because the phenol synths only receive MIDI on channel 1. So both of these are only listening to channel 1 MIDI, and if I try to send out two different channels from the Zoya, well, only one of them would be received, and they both would receive the same channel 1. So I wouldn't be able to send out MIDI from my Zoya to both of these and expect them to get two different sequences, for instance. So, and then the only solution to that problem is to get something like the iConnectivity mioXM, which lets you reroute the MIDI so that you can send on any two channels from the Zoya into the mioXM. And then that is routed to the specific MIDI output as, so say I send on channel 5 and 6 on the Zoya, it doesn't matter which channels they are, just whichever channels are available and doesn't cause any conflicts with other stuff. So channel 5 comes into the XM and is sent out to the MIDI output going to this phenol, but it translates that channel 5 into channel 1 on that output, and then the channel 6 coming out from the Zoya is going to another output that is sent to the second phenol, but again it is translated as channel 1. So this is the way that you have to route it in order for a single MIDI generating device like the Zoya to control two separate MIDI streams to two phenols. Now, there may be other synthesizers that have this quirk as well. I don't know what is available out there, but in my case, this is the only way that I can control these two separately, is to use a MIDI router like the mioXM. So I'm going to show you how to set that up, how I set that up to do this. Now, there's another challenge, of course, that may present itself sometimes when you're working with MIDI. My Zoya now has only got MIDI on, well, mini jacks and on DIN plugs with a adapter like this, but it does not have the ability to receive MIDI over USB. So if I want to connect my MIDI fighter twister to control the Zoya, that has to be connected via a MIDI USB host or via a computer. So and that, of course, the MIDI routers you get, like the Mio series, they also have the ability to work as MIDI USB hosts. This one for up to 8 MIDI devices. It's got 4 sockets, but it can do another 4 if you use a powered MIDI, a powered USB hub, I should say. So I'm just going to run you through now how I connect these things together to start my setup, and then I'm going to show you my setup on the computer, how I route things. So first things first, the MIDI fighter twister is connected with USB now to one of the USB sockets on the Mio. The USB sockets on the Mio are not numbered because they are the number of the port that a USB device gets is decided in the order they're plugged in. So when I plug this in, then that gets USB host number 1. If I plug a second device in, regardless of which socket I use, that is USB host 2, etc. I'm only using one, so that doesn't really make a difference to my setup, but that's one thing to be aware of. Whereas the MIDI ports, on the other hand, they are numbered and very specific. So I want to be able to send MIDI data from the MIDI fighter twister to the Empress Effect Zoya, which means we have to connect the MIDI input of the Zoya to one of the MIDI ports now on the Mio. And I'm just going to untangle the cables here a little bit. So on the back here, we got MIDI 2 in and out. So I want the out, which is the blue cable, to be connected to the Zoya input, which is this one here. So that goes like so. And of course, very importantly, I also want to send MIDI data out from the Zoya. So that has to go to, and I'm using the same port now. So I'm using the port 2 input to connect to the Zoya's output. So now we have that connected up to the hub. Additionally, I want, of course, to connect the phenols. And so I'm using port 3 output from the iConnectivity now to connect to the input of one of the phenols. And I'm using the port 4, MIDI DIN out port 4, to connect to, let's see if I can move this in a way that doesn't get in the way, to the second phenol, like so. Another thing that I'm not sure how important this is in my setup. Now, these are banana jack synths, and a quirk with banana jacks, which you may or may not know, is that the signal cables, when you patch things together, they only carry the signal, they do not carry ground. And of course, ground in this case is common voltage reference, chassis ground, often called. So at the back of my phenols now, I have two ground sockets. Now, technically, they don't necessarily need to be patched together, because if you plug any audio in and out of these, then that too will actually ground them together. But it is a good rule of thumb, doesn't matter what you do, before you do much else, that you should really connect the grounds together. So I have a cable. I can't actually see that now. I'm just gonna, so in the back here, in the ground connections, there's a cable going in there, and it goes into the same socket on the phenol at the back. And this is another thing that I'm not sure if this is going to be needed, but just to be on the safe side, the iConnectivity also has a ground connector on the back here. And to make sure that, just to doubly sure that all these use the common voltage reference, I have connected a little banana jack socket there, just to be sure, and I'm going to connect that to my phenols. So now when I connect that, that means that the mioXM and both phenols now share the same voltage reference ground. And I'm also taking the audio out from the back phenol here. I'm not doing the front one at the moment. And that is connected to the audio inputs of the Zoya, and that also shares the ground connection. So now all these devices are sharing the same ground connection. Right, so that may or may not be important, but it's an important thing to, it's better to do it when you don't need to, rather than not doing it, because what can happen is, if you touch your chassis, you might get an electric shock if some of these things don't share the ground connection together. So always something that should be done. Right, so what's next? So now I have these devices connected together via the iConnectivity hub, but how do I make them talk to each other in the same language, in this case MIDI? And how do I route the Zoya to these synths? Well, first of all, I'm going to talk a little bit about what I have set up on the Zoya here, just a really basic thing. So what I have here, I'm just going to make it start now. So I have two sequences. So it's running two sequences, each of 5 steps. I haven't actually set any note values here. I'll just do like so. And which are controlled by an LFO. And the output of these two sequences is sent to MIDI note outputs. Let's see. They also need a gate input, by the way, like that. Okay. So, so I have 2 MIDI note outputs. And actually, when I did that, you can also already see there's MIDI activity here. And the way a note output works is that it has 2 values. It needs a note value, and it needs a gate. This is standard MIDI. Usually, those two things are always connected together. And very often you find that MIDI equipment, they don't respond to they wouldn't respond to a note change unless it was also accompanied by a gate message, or you can think of it as a note on message. So a gate actually is, in MIDI terms, really defines note on message, and then whatever note value is present when note on starts, that's the one that is sent as a note value, and then when the gate stops, that's a note off message. And that is what's happening now on the Zoya. It's sending a gate which sets the note on and the note off. And that's what the phenols need as well to play the notes. Now, there is a pitch out that is separate from gate out on this, you may see, but it does not respond to the pitch output unless it also is sent a gate or a note on message from the Zoya. So that's a good start. Now, and the second thing I want to do now is to be able to control the speed of these sequences from the MIDI Fighter Twister. And you can see it actually does that now. So I'm rotating this, and the speed changes. Like so. I actually have to power up these things. Now, if you see here, okay, now I powered on you can see that both are receiving. Actually, you cannot really see the lights there, but behind the plugs here, there is a little red light showing MIDI activity. And you can also see the gate out is now flashing because it is receiving gates from these. Now, if I try to do two different gates now from the, I was going to change the connection there. Let's see, that's the wrong one. That is not the one I wanted. But I'm going to do a second, I'm just going to do a second LFO on my Zoya just to demonstrate this now. Swing control on. So I'm going to control one of the sequences from one LFO and the second from a second LFO. And I'm going to work at different speeds now. So if you look here, this one is flashing slowly, this one is flashing faster. And that indicates to me now that this actually has, because this is a setting I used last time I used the iConnectivity, it retains that setting, and which is a great thing, by the way, if you have a standard setup. And that means that now these are actually behaving the way I want them to. I'm going to go and show you in the setup. Right, so here we are in the Oracle for X Series desktop software. I've connected my iConnectivity now with a USB cable, and these are the different tabs. I'm not going to show you everything here. I'm just going to show you the real basics of what I'm doing right now. So first of all, I'm going to look at MIDI routing. Well, this is where we have our sources and destinations, and at the moment I'm not using DIN port 1, that's the one on the front of the device. Normally I wouldn't use it unless I had to, because it makes the device so much bigger. DIN 2 is where we have our Zoya connected, and as you can see, it is sending out its MIDI to, well, the important ones are actually to the DIN 1, 3, and 4, so it's sending to all other ports than itself. And also I've set it to send on USB host 1 and 2, and that is in case I connect something on MIDI USB host 1 and 2 that can also receive MIDI. For instance, the MIDI Fighter Twister I have connected to MIDI host 1 now can also receive MIDI, and it can change the behavior, it can change the bank, it can do different things. It can create lighting effects and color effects on the MIDI Fighter Twister. And these are things I haven't been playing around with much because I haven't had the ability now to send back MIDI to it as easily as I can now. And let's look at USB MIDI host 1, which is our MIDI Fighter Twister. It is now set to only send to, well, of course, to host computer, but that's not important right now. The DIN MIDI 2, so it only sends to the Zoya, and this is important because it is also working on channel 1 at the moment. So it doesn't have to, of course, but for simplicity's sake, I'm using pretty much the default setup of the MIDI Fighter Twister, which sends out on MIDI channel 1. And if I did that, it could interfere with the workings of the channel 1 on the Phenols. And so I want to only send that to the Zoya, nowhere else. And where the real magic happens is in the second tab here called Filter and Remap. I'm not doing any changes on the inputs. So whatever comes in now, all the MIDI data is coming into the Mio, no changes. But what I want to do is for channel 5 and 6, that is what I'm sending out from the Zoya now, to be converted to channel 1 on each of the Phenol outputs. So I have to go to Output, and I'm not filtering, I'm not removing messages, I'm remapping messages. And I am remapping a message on DIN MIDI 3 first of all. So this is one of the connections where I have connected a Phenol. And as you can see, what this is telling the iConnectivity to do is to take all the messages on channel 5. So that's the channel that I've dedicated to this Phenol that the Zoya is using, and remap those to channel 1. So that means that everything that is channel 5 from the Zoya will be sent to channel 1 on one of the phenols, on the first phenol. And the second phenol has exactly the same thing, except it's using channel 6. So it will only receive on channel 1 everything that is sent from channel 6 on the Zoya. And this is absolutely amazing that you can do this, because this makes life so much easier, and it increases quite a lot the control I can have over my phenol synthesizers without having to include any additional MIDI interfaces in my setup, which would have been an alternative, of course. Because instead of doing what I'm doing now, of course, now the phenols each have their own MIDI interface, but it's quite a basic one. It is note, it is mod, so that's CC1, gate and clock, and that's it. It also has a record and loop function, so we can record a little section of MIDI, and or a long section actually, and it can loop it, and that's it. So if I'd wanted, for instance, a more complex setup where I had, say, 4 CVs and 12 gates, that can't really be done with that interface, and then I would have had to get another MIDI interface that I can connect to the Zoya, and then connect from that MIDI interface to the phenols, in which case I might not have needed to do this complex setup actually in order to accomplish anything. But it's nice to have as many MIDI CC streams as possible, I think, and it makes life easier, and very often this is enough. An interesting point to note, by the way, is that when you're working with MIDI interfaces on synthesizers, at least on a patchable one like the Phenol, the note out message doesn't have to be note out. You can actually go and select, it's just a socket on the panel, and it has to be patched to note in order to B note. Of course, on most synthesizers, it is automatically routed to the note and gate inputs of the device, and when you play notes on a keyboard, for instance, it will automatically create those notes on the synth. On the Phenol, this is different because it's just a control value that is linked to the gate, and so you can use the pitch output for anything, and you can use the gate output for anything, you can use the clock output for anything, and the mod output for absolutely anything, which is very useful. The only caveat is, I think, that the pitch output doesn't send anything out unless you also have the gate activated. I think that's the only caveat. So yes, so the main thing now, of course, the rerouting is possible because of the iConnectivity XM. And another thing about the Oracle interface now is that when you change something now in this interface, you don't have to save it. Every time you make a change, just like with MIDI control, it is automatically sent to the device and saved on it. So if I do any little change now, it's automatically updated, and the only reason you need to save setups is really if you have more than one setup and you want to make sure you have full control over them. So that's it really, the really basic workings now of the mioXM as a router or translator of MIDI from one channel to another, and it works really well, I must say. So let's go back to my desktop and I'll just play a little bit using this setup. I'm going to just start my recording over here as well, just so we can just do a sound check like that to synchronize the recording. I'm gonna, oh, actually that's a little tip for you, by the way. If you want to synchronize an audio recording with something out, with a video, anything in your synthesizer that gives you visual feedback together with sound is going to be your best way of synchronizing it. Now, of course, one way to do it is to make sure that your keyboard isn't short, and you just push down a key very shortly until you get very sharp, and you need a short attack as well for your sound, and you just get a very short, sharp sound. that you can visually identify and then match with the video. In my case, what I'm doing is I make a little oscillator with a sawtooth, and I have a VCA that's connected to the left stomp switch. And when I push this, then also you can see it on the lighting up on the panel, and also that corresponds then with the sound that's on my recording. Okay, so I'm going to take the pitch output to the pitch input of these oscillators, and then I'm going to take the pulse output to the VCA, pulse output VCA. I'm going to use the gates to control the VCA. So pretty standard synthesizer patching now. Output, and of course I'm using the upper one here now. So I'm going to take the output of this also to this top one, and let's see, am I getting any sound coming in to my, where is my audio input? Yeah, but that's not patched to the output yet, so I need to do like that. And Right, and that's it. And I hope you found that interesting and or useful or entertaining, whatever the case is. And thank you for watching, and goodbye for now.